Interference in our country, in our democratic processes, is an ongoing challenge from many different countries, including China.
I'm Kieran Outshorn. Allegations that Beijing has been meddling in our last two federal elections has seized Parliament Hill and many in its orbit. As an example, just this week, the entire board of directors and the president and CEO of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation resigned, all because of allegations that they had received donations from an advisor to the Chinese government. Now, it doesn't help that Canada's relationship with China has been pretty frosty for a minute, but China's meddling has caused a major headache for the Liberal government, with many unanswered questions, like what actually happened and who knew, and what impact it's had. The first signs came in May of 2022, when CSIS released its annual report, saying that threats of foreign interference ramped up in the previous year. The spy agency highlighted persistent and sophisticated efforts to steal Canada's information and intellectual property in the form of cyber attacks and disinformation. In November, a senior CSIS official told the House of Commons committee that without a doubt, China was, quote, the foremost aggressor when it came to foreign interference.
China, I would say, by comparison, is more interested in working within the system to corrupt it, compromising officials and elected officials and individuals at all levels of government, within this industry, within civil society. So using our open and free society for their nefarious purposes.
A few days later, a Global News report said that CSIS had warned Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that China had been targeting Canada through a foreign interference campaign and had covertly funded a clandestine network of candidates in the 2019 election. Trudeau later said he'd never been briefed on the matter. Near the end of the month, the government released a long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy. It contained about $2 billion in investments that, in part, aimed to strengthen Canadian, quote, infrastructure and democracy and Canadian citizens against foreign interference. The next day, then RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki sent a letter to the House of Commons committee saying that the police organization is looking into possible election interference from China, but provided no details on what type of activities were being investigated. Then, more sensitive intelligence documents were leaked to the media, this time showing that China worked to influence the 2021 federal election by pushing for an election of a minority Liberal government. Meanwhile, calls for a public inquiry continued to grow.
I think we all collectively owe it to understand what is and is not happening, to reassure people, and I think a public inquiry would do that.
To get this out of the hands of the to and fro partisan politics in the media cycle, and to take a cold hard look on the threats that Canada faces.
A few days later, a panel of civil servants tasked with monitoring threats to Canada's elections concluded that attempts to interfere in both the 2019 and the 2021 elections did not compromise the results. But the man who authored the report held a role for the Trudeau Foundation, which has led to calls from the opposition for an independent inquiry.
Our institutions are the foundations of our democracy. Even when they're strong, even when they're sturdy, if there's a perception that they might not be, it needs to be addressed.
In early March, the Prime Minister tasked several investigative bodies to look into foreign election interference and announced a special rapporteur to examine the issue and make recommendations on combating interference and strengthening democracy. Former Governor General David Johnston was later announced to fill that role. He now has until May 23rd to decide whether or not to launch a public inquiry into China's interference in Canadian elections. That brings us to now. So what's next? Well, a House of Commons committee has also been looking into foreign interference. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, is expected to appear before them tomorrow. So for more on that, we've reached out to Catherine Cullen. She's the host of the CBC political podcast, The House. Hey, Catherine, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us.
Happy to do it.
Okay, so starting off here, what are we expecting to hear from Katie Telford on Friday?
Well, Karen, just the fact that she is testifying before committee, that's a big deal, right? She is the Prime Minister's closest aide. She has been with him the whole time he has been Prime Minister. She's right there in the Prime Minister's office. She has a good sense of what would have been going on, what was understood on this file. But if the question is, are we going to get, Hollywood blockbuster style explosions, plot twists, whatever, I think we need to sort of tamp down our expectations a bit on that front, because we've heard other national officials testify before committee about foreign interference, right? This has been a big issue in Ottawa for a while. And what we so often hear from them is they're not going to acknowledge the leaks that have already been in the media. They're not going to talk about particular issues because they are so sensitive in terms of national security. Still, though, 2 hours, even if she does shed a bit more light, because this issue is so important in terms of our democracy and because it's so sensitive politically, this testimony really does matter.
Do we have a sense of what the impact might be for the Liberal government coming out of her testimony?
Yeah, certainly it puts the question of foreign interference back in the spotlight. On Parliament Hill, we've been focused on other things in the past couple of weeks, right? The government's put forward a budget. Joe Biden came to visit at a time when the Prime Minister had really been dogged by questions about what was going on with other countries, particularly China, meddling in Canada's elections. So here we go. It's back on the front burner with this testimony on Friday. And we know it's not going away, right? We still have at least months of this as we wait to see what David Johnston is going to decide in terms of what he recommends the government should do.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, this is the question that seems to always come up whenever we're dealing with these sort of political questions, but does this situation push us closer to an election? Do we have any sense of that?
I would say it doesn't, because of that deal between the NDP and the Liberals, right? Both parties seem pretty happy with it. And if you view it as something of a scandal, certainly it's a source of concern. It's not exactly going to encourage the government to say, to heck with the deal, let's call an election. I think, though, the important and interesting question, we know foreign interference is going to be an issue in the next election because it is about how we conduct our elections. We don't know when we're going to vote yet, but I can guarantee you that we're going to be talking about whether or not other countries, particularly whether or not Beijing is trying to meddle in those elections. The other important question, though, is whether or not this is going to be an issue for the Prime Minister in the next election. Is this setting up a narrative, the kind of thing that undermines people's trust in him, or does he find a way to deal with this in a way that sort of makes it go away? Will we still be talking about it when we go to the ballot box, whenever that might be?
Well, so let me ask you this, maybe as a last question, because I think there's a lot of Canadians who feel like this entire sort of episode has maybe undermined their sense of trust in the democratic process. Is there something that the government can do or that we expect they will do to try to rebuild that trust leading up to whenever we go and vote next?
Yeah, the Prime Minister does say often that he acknowledges it's undermined trust. And whenever we talk about it, Kieran, I do think it's really important to say, polls suggest that there's a subsection of people who think that this means that, our election was stolen, a la Donald Trump allegations. Not the case. No one in any of the political parties thinks that this actually changed the final results of the election. But the polls also show that a lot of Canadians would like more answers. And so, I think there's a lot of pressure on David Johnston and thus on the government to call a public inquiry. There are a lot of questions about what that would look like. How much can you really say publicly about all of this? But it's clear Canadians want more answers. Who knew what? And fundamentally, what were these other countries, particularly, the regime in Beijing, trying to do? We know they were trying to mess with our elections. What actually happened? How much of that can we shed some light on, understanding that it's all dealing with some sensitive national security issues?
Mm-hmm. So we have Telford here on Friday, and I know that this committee is going forward, and obviously the former Governor General, he's moving forward with this investigation. What do we expect will come next in terms of this sort of story continuing to unfold? Do we know what the next steps will be?
You definitely want to keep your eye on David Johnston, who has until May 23rd to give his suggestions to the Prime Minister in terms of what to do. And I say suggestions, but in fact, the government has already said whatever those recommendations are, they're going to adopt them. There are a lot of things that could happen in the meantime. Committees are going to continue to call witnesses and pursue this because, of course, it is such a hot topic politically. Yes, there's that air of potential scandal around it, but also, as I said, important to our democracy. So you're going to be looking at who else MPs are trying to question to better understand this. You're going to be looking at the sources of these leaks. Are we going to learn more about, will there be new allegations that come to light? What kind of actions does the government take? And then there are other bodies looking at this too. This so-called secret committee, National Security Information, it's NSICOP is the acronym. There's a lot to keep track of there, but they're doing an investigation into this. So we don't know what's going to come next. What we do know is that we're going to be talking about this for the next couple of months, and then if there's a public inquiry, who knows, possibly for years.
Yeah. Okay, well, Catherine, we really appreciate you coming in and sort of filling it in for us. And I know that if people are interested in trying to follow along with this, you guys are going to be covering that on your show, The House, so people can check that out as well. So, Catherine, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.